Eleanor stood at the threshold of Ravenshade Manor, her heart pounding in her chest. The moonlight bathed the grand mansion in an ethereal glow, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if the very ground beneath her feet knew what was about to unfold. The wedding had been perfect. Victor Langley, handsome and charming, had pledged his undying love to her. The guests had cheered, the wine had flowed freely, and everything had seemed as it should. But now, in the quiet of the manor's great hall, a chilling silence settled. The echoes of the celebration felt distant, as though they belonged to another life. Victor's voice broke the stillness, soft and alluring as he stepped toward her, his dark eyes gleaming with possessive hunger. "My love, it's time." He took her hand, his touch colder than she had expected. She allowed him to lead her through the grand staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. Something was wrong, something she couldn't name. The door to their bedroom creaked open, and Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine. The room was impeccably prepared, the bed draped in silks and flowers, but the air was thick with something she couldn't place, an oppressive energy, a warning. Victor turned to her, his gaze softer now, but there was a flicker of something darker behind his eyes. "It will all be perfect, my bride. You'll see." As he approached her, Eleanor's heart raced. She had been swept away by the promise of a fairy tale romance, but now, beneath his charm, something terrifying lurked. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she could feel it, a presence, lurking in the shadows of the room. Just as Victor reached for her, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles in a flash. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. The temperature dropped, and the silence was shattered by a voice, a whisper, one that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Eleanor." Her name was a breath, like a ghostly caress against her ear. Victor stiffened, his face tightening, as though he had heard it too. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "It's nothing," he said, his voice too calm. "Only the wind." But Eleanor's skin prickled. This was no wind. This was something far worse. Before she could speak, the room seemed to shift, the shadows lengthening. She felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. And then, with a sudden flash, the door slammed shut behind her. "Victor," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what is this?" His face darkened. "The night has only just begun, Eleanor. Trust me." But the words felt hollow, like a promise made in a dream that would shatter before the morning light. Victor's hands trembled as he reached for Eleanor's face, his cold fingers brushing against her warm skin. She had once believed that their love could conquer all, that nothing in this world, or the next, could tear them apart. But now, standing in this cursed room, with the shadow of something ancient and malicious pressing down on them, she wondered if she had been wrong. He pulled her closer, his lips meeting hers in a desperate kiss. But it wasn't the kiss she had imagined on their wedding night. There was no sweetness in it. No warmth. Just a chill, a cold that seeped into her very bones, chilling her from the inside out. "Victor, what's happening?" she whispered against his lips, her voice shaking. His eyes, usually so confident and full of fire, were now clouded with something darker. "Don't speak," he whispered, his breath warm but unsteady. "You'll understand soon. I'll make you understand." Suddenly, the room grew colder, the temperature plummeting to an impossible chill. Eleanor gasped, shivering as icy tendrils wrapped around her body, as if the very air itself was suffocating her. The candles on the bedside table flickered out one by one, plunging the room into darkness. A voice echoed through the silence, not from Victor, but from somewhere deeper, more ancient. "Eleanor." The voice was faint, a whisper, but it filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. She pulled away from Victor, her heart racing. She knew that voice. It was a voice from her past, a voice that had been silenced forever. "Catherine," Eleanor breathed, her hands trembling. Victor's expression faltered for a brief moment before he quickly masked it with a grin. "It's nothing," he said, his voice strained. "Just the wind again." But Eleanor wasn't convinced. The woman he had once called his bride was dead. Drowned. But her spirit, it seemed, was not so easily extinguished. And the realization hit Eleanor like a bolt of lightning. The wedding night she had longed for, the fairy tale love story she had dreamed of, was never meant to be. This wasn't a union of love. It was a dark, twisted bond forged in something far more sinister. And Catherine's voice, from beyond the grave, was a warning. Eleanor staggered back, her mind reeling. She tried to breathe, to steady her thoughts, but the cold grew worse, the presence of something dark pressing in from all sides. And Victor stood there, his gaze never leaving her, his expression unreadable. "Victor," she whispered, trembling. "What have you done?" Victor's lips curled into a twisted smile. "What I had to. What I was forced to." And now, he took a step toward her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Now, you belong to me, Eleanor." But as he advanced, Eleanor's thoughts spun wildly, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't deny the truth any longer. This was not love. This was a curse. A curse that had started long before her wedding night, and one that would follow her into eternity. The clock struck midnight. The ancient grandfather clock in the corner of the room let out an ominous chime, its deep toll reverberating through the manor's dark halls. Eleanor couldn't tear her eyes away from Victor, who stood across from her, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. The man she had once vowed to love forever now seemed like a stranger, his every movement cloaked in shadows. "Do you feel it, Eleanor?" Victor asked, his voice low and filled with something unsettling. "The bond we share, the promises that bind us, even now." Eleanor wanted to scream, to break free of the suffocating air around her, but she couldn't move. Her heart was heavy with dread, each beat a painful reminder of what she had unknowingly bound herself to. The vows they had exchanged were meant to be sacred, an eternal promise of love and devotion. But as Eleanor remembered the words she had spoken that day, they felt like chains around her neck, tightening with each passing second. Those vows hadn't been spoken in love, they had been spoken in desperation, in the heat of a spell that bound them in more ways than one. Victor stepped closer, his dark eyes searching her face, as if waiting for some sign, some flicker of understanding. But Eleanor had already begun to realize the horrifying truth. The ceremony that had bound them together had been twisted, a mockery of the love they should have shared. The vows had been cursed from the start, a pact made with forces beyond their comprehension. "You don't understand, do you?" Victor continued, his voice soft yet sinister. "You think you can walk away from me, but the vows are more than just words. They are a part of us, Eleanor. A part of our souls. We are bound in ways that go beyond this life." Eleanor recoiled, her breath hitching in her chest. She felt the weight of his words settle on her, cold and suffocating. The room seemed to shrink around her as the walls closed in, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. "But you can break them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You can break this curse." Victor's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "There is no breaking it, Eleanor. There is only acceptance. Only surrender." The words echoed in her mind as he reached for her, his hands gentle yet unyielding. The weight of his touch made her skin crawl, and she instinctively pulled away. But she couldn't escape. There was no escape. Victor's voice was now a mere whisper, but the force behind it was unrelenting. "You are mine. Forever." Eleanor's chest tightened as she tried to fight the panic rising within her. The vows were unfinished, incomplete. They had been spoken, but they had never truly been fulfilled. And now, in the dead of night, with no one to hear her cries, Eleanor realized that they would never be. The bond had been forged. There was no going back. Not now. Not ever. The silence of Ravenshade Manor was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling under the weight of time. Eleanor lay awake in their vast bed, her body still as cold as the stone walls surrounding her. Beside her, Victor's breathing was slow and steady, though she knew he was awake. He always was when the night reached its darkest hour. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a suffocating feeling that crawled beneath Eleanor's skin. She turned her head, staring at the shadows cast by the moonlight, stretching across the floor like long, jagged fingers. Her thoughts swirled, her mind racing, but one thought stood out above the rest: Catherine. The name echoed in her mind, a whisper she could no longer ignore. Eleanor could feel the presence of the woman who had once been Victor's bride, a specter lingering in the corners of her mind, haunting her every step. Victor stirred beside her, his hand instinctively reaching for her waist. "Eleanor," he murmured, but there was a tremor in his voice. "You're awake." She stiffened. His touch, once so reassuring, now sent a shiver down her spine. He was no longer the man she had married. He was something else, something far darker. Something she feared. "Victor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Catherine's here, isn't she?" Victor's hand stilled, and for a long moment, there was only silence. Then, in a voice low and hoarse, he answered, "She never left." The word struck Eleanor like a dagger. "What do you mean? What did you do to her?" The words escaped her before she could stop them, the truth clawing its way to the surface. The air grew heavy around them, the temperature dropping as the tension in the room thickened. Victor's voice trembled as he spoke, his words full of regret. "It wasn't supposed to be this way. I didn't want it to happen, but I had no choice." His hand curled into a fist against the sheets, and Eleanor could hear the strain in his voice. "I promised her forever, just like I promised you. But promises are fragile things." Eleanor's heart began to pound. "What did you do, Victor?" she demanded, her voice rising in desperation. "I tried to save her," he whispered. "But the darkness, the curse, it was already too late. Catherine's love for me twisted her spirit. It bound her to this place, to this house. And now," he paused, the words choking him. "Now, she's watching us. She won't let us be." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. A cold wind whispered through the room, and the shadows seemed to stir as if alive. The soft, mournful sound of a woman's voice drifted through the air, a voice she recognized, Catherine's voice, so faint, so distant. "Victor, why did you leave me?" Eleanor's eyes widened in horror. She could hear her, too. The voice was unmistakable, like a memory echoing from the grave. But it wasn't just Catherine's voice. There was something else in it, something that chilled Eleanor to the bone. She looked at Victor, whose face was as pale as a ghost. His eyes darted to the door, as if expecting something, or someone, to appear. The temperature in the room dropped even further, the candlelight flickering, casting strange shadows that danced on the walls. "Victor," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "What have you done?" Victor didn't answer. He simply sat up, his face ashen, his eyes filled with a terror that matched Eleanor's own. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the walls of the manor itself were speaking to them. Eleanor felt the weight of the curse press down on her. Catherine was no longer just a memory. She was here. And she was angry. The haunting whispers wrapped around Eleanor's mind like tendrils, pulling her deeper into the darkness. And then, as the clock struck once again, the door to their bedroom creaked open, though there was no one there. But the air shifted, and Eleanor knew, without a doubt, that Catherine was watching them. Waiting. Victor's eyes darted toward the door, his face paling further. "It's too late, Eleanor. She's come to claim us both." Victor could feel the weight of his sins crushing him, suffocating him. He had tried to bury the memories, tried to drown the guilt in the shadows of the night, but they came back every time, more powerful than before. The whispers of Catherine's voice were a constant presence, swirling around him like a storm he could never escape. He stood before the grand mirror in the hallway, staring at his reflection, his eyes hollow, his face gaunt from sleepless nights. The man he saw staring back at him was no longer the man who had once been filled with ambition and promise. That Victor had been consumed by a a decision that had shattered not only his life but the lives of those he loved, and now, that decision haunted him. Victor had loved Catherine. He had promised her forever. But that promise had been broken long before he met Eleanor. He had thought that by marrying Eleanor, he could escape the curse that hung over him, the weight of a love lost and the guilt that followed. But in his heart, he knew that no matter what he did, he could never outrun the shadow of Catherine. His hands shook as he traced the outline of the mirror with his fingers, the cool glass offering no solace. He could feel her presence behind him, even though he knew she wasn't physically there. Catherine's anger, her jealousy, it had all been unleashed the night of their wedding, when she had returned from the grave to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. And now, with Eleanor by his side, the curse had taken root again. Victor closed his eyes, and the memories flooded back in a rush. It had been a stormy night when Catherine had died. He had been unable to save her, despite his desperate attempts. But the truth was, he had never truly tried. He had been selfish, caught up in his own desires and ambitions, and he had let her slip away. He had promised her love, but his heart had already been torn by another, by the thought of a future without her. Victor's eyes snapped open, and his reflection seemed to warp, flickering with a shadow of Catherine's face. Her eyes stared back at him, filled with rage, filled with betrayal. "You abandoned me," the reflection whispered. "You abandoned me, and now you'll pay." Victor gasped, stepping back, his heart pounding in his chest. His hand reached out for the nearest chair to steady himself. But the voice echoed in his mind, relentless, accusing. "You promised me forever, Victor. But you lied." Eleanor's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "Victor?" Her voice was soft, filled with concern, but he could hear the fear beneath it. He had never been able to hide his torment from her, not even when he tried. Victor turned to face her, his face a mask of anguish. "It's happening again, Eleanor," he said, his voice strained, barely above a whisper. "Catherine won't let go. I thought we could escape this, but it's too late. She's here. She's always been here, waiting." Eleanor took a step toward him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the man she had once known. But all she saw was a broken shell, a man consumed by the weight of his past. "You need to tell me what happened, Victor," she said, her voice steady, but her fear was evident in her eyes. "You're not telling me everything. You're hiding something from me, and it's tearing us apart." Victor closed his eyes again, feeling the guilt clawing at him from the inside. The truth was unbearable, but Eleanor deserved to know. If he was to be haunted, if they were to be cursed together, then at least she deserved the full truth. "I was responsible for her death, Eleanor," Victor confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't try hard enough. I didn't fight for her. I chose a future without her, and now, she wants revenge." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching longer, darker. The air itself felt suffocating as the full weight of his confession settled in. Eleanor's eyes widened, and she stepped back, her hand instinctively clutching the edge of the doorframe. "What are you saying, Victor? Are you telling me that Catherine's spirit is here because of you? Because of what you did?" Victor nodded, his voice barely audible. "Yes. And now she's going to take everything from us. Everything I love. Starting with you." The clock in the hallway ticked louder with each passing second, the sound growing more menacing as the witching hour approached. Eleanor sat in a chair by the window, her eyes fixed on the moonlit garden beyond, though she saw nothing. Her mind raced, each thought a tangled mess of fear and uncertainty. There was something alive in the house, something she couldn't understand, something that had followed them here. Victor had tried to comfort her, but the cracks in his calm exterior were becoming more obvious with each passing moment. He hadn't told her everything. There were pieces of the puzzle he still kept hidden, fragments of a past too dark for her to comprehend. And yet, she felt it, something was coming. Something terrible. The air grew heavier, colder. Eleanor shivered, pulling the blanket closer around her shoulders, her breath forming clouds in the chill. She could hear the wind howling outside, the branches of the trees scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. But it wasn't just the storm outside that unsettled her. No, it was the unease in the air, a feeling that there was something waiting, watching, just beyond the veil of reality. Victor had left her alone for a moment, and in that silence, she could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her. The echoes of footsteps on the wooden floors, the flicker of shadows from the corner of her eye, she could feel them all, though there was no one there. And then, the silence was broken. A soft creak. The faintest sound of the door to their bedroom slowly opening. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she turned, her heart hammering in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. Standing in the doorway was the figure of a woman, her pale, gaunt face lit by the dim light of the candle on the dresser. Her eyes were dark, hollow, as if they had seen too much, as if they had once been full of life but were now empty, consumed by an unearthly longing. It was Catherine. But she was not the woman Eleanor had imagined, the delicate, beautiful bride Victor had once promised himself to. No. This Catherine was something different. A ghost, a specter, a living nightmare. Her gown, once white and elegant, was now tattered, stained with the dirt and decay of the grave. Her hair hung in disheveled strands around her face, and her skin, pale and cold, looked as though it had been untouched by time. Eleanor's voice caught in her throat, unable to scream, unable to move. Her eyes locked onto Catherine's, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something, pain, perhaps? Or was it rage? Victor, Catherine whispered, her voice a haunting breath that sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. The name was spoken like a prayer, a longing that twisted through the air like a spell. Eleanor stood up, her legs trembling. She wanted to run, wanted to escape the figure in front of her, but she was rooted to the spot. Catherine's gaze turned to her then, and Eleanor could feel the weight of the woman's resentment, as if her very presence was a curse. You, Catherine's voice broke, and there was something almost mournful in her tone, though it was laced with venom. You think you can take him from me? You think you can steal his heart? Eleanor's chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. I didn't, Victor, he's not yours anymore. Catherine let out a low laugh, one that sounded more like a death rattle than anything human. He never was mine to begin with, she said, her eyes flickering with madness. He was always meant to be mine in the end, in death as in life. You, Eleanor, were just a pawn in this game. With a sudden movement, Catherine stepped forward, and Eleanor felt the air in the room grow thick, as though the very walls were closing in on her. Catherine's hand reached out, her fingers cold as ice, and before Eleanor could react, they brushed against her cheek. Eleanor gasped, feeling the chill of death seep into her bones, her vision blurring at the edges. What do you want from me? She whispered, her voice barely a sound. Catherine's smile was cruel, twisted. I want what was promised to me, Eleanor. I want Victor. And you, she trailed off, her voice softening, almost sadistic. You will suffer the consequences for taking what was never yours to have. Suddenly, the room seemed to darken, the shadows deepening, swallowing the light. Eleanor tried to pull away, but Catherine's grip tightened, her presence suffocating, oppressive. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, Catherine vanished, disappearing into the darkness, leaving only the faint scent of decay in the air. Eleanor collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her body trembling with fear. Had it been real? Or had her mind finally cracked under the weight of the curse? The door slammed shut, and the silence returned, but this time, it felt different. It felt final. Eleanor's eyes darted to the clock, her heart stopping in her chest as the hands reached midnight once more. Eleanor had barely slept that night. The haunting vision of Catherine still lingered in her mind, each whispered word echoing in her thoughts like a constant hum in her ears. She had woken up, shaken and covered in sweat, unsure of what was real and what had been a product of her overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew. She could feel it in her bones, the presence of something otherworldly, something unrelenting. Victor, unaware of the full extent of Catherine's return, had tried to comfort her as best as he could. He held her close, but his touch felt distant, as though he too was lost in a world he could no longer escape. His silence weighed heavily on Eleanor. He wasn't telling her everything, and she was starting to question if she truly knew the man she had married. As night fell again, Eleanor found herself standing at the window, staring out at the garden where shadows danced beneath the silver light of the moon. She had no intention of sleeping. Her body felt restless, her mind frantic. She needed answers. And yet, she feared what those answers might be. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, sending shivers down her spine. She tried to push the fear aside, to tell herself that it was just the storm. But then, she heard it, the soft sound of footsteps in the hall. Her heart leaped into her throat as she turned toward the door. The shadows seemed to shift around her, as though they were alive. And then, the door creaked open. Victor entered, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He had been distant all day, his mind clearly elsewhere, consumed by whatever torment he was hiding. But tonight, there was something different in his demeanor. Something more urgent. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she saw the look in his eyes. His gaze was empty, but there was a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. It was as if he were torn between two worlds. "Victor," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening? What's going on?" He stepped toward her, but it wasn't the Victor she had married who moved. It was as if someone, or something, was controlling him, pulling his strings. His movements were stiff, mechanical, as though he were no longer fully present. And then, he reached out for her, his hand cold and clammy. His touch sent a shock of ice through her skin, and she gasped, stepping back. "Victor, please," she pleaded, her voice rising with panic. "What's happening to you?" For a moment, his expression softened. His lips parted as if to speak, but the words that came out were not his own. They were Catherine's. "Eleanor," the voice purred, low and breathless. "You don't understand, do you? You never will." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, his cold fingers digging into her skin. His eyes, once full of love, were now consumed by something dark. Something that wasn't him. "Catherine," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're in him, aren't you?" Victor, no, it wasn't Victor anymore, let out a low chuckle, the sound twisted and foreign. "I have always been here, Eleanor," the voice taunted. "I was never gone. And now, he belongs to me." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she realized the truth. The love she had thought would save her was now the very thing that would destroy her. Victor's soul had been claimed long ago by Catherine, and now she was left to watch as her husband's body became a vessel for the woman who would never let him go. Eleanor tried to break free, but the grip on her wrist tightened. She could feel the chill of death creeping over her, seeping into her bones. Catherine's spirit had taken hold of Victor, and she wasn't letting go. The phantom's embrace was suffocating, consuming every shred of hope Eleanor had left. "You think you can take him from me?" Catherine's voice laughed. "You think you can undo what's been done? No, Eleanor. This is your fate. This is your punishment." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she realized the true horror of her situation. She had fallen into a nightmare from which there was no escape. She was trapped in the middle of a love that had turned into a curse, a love that would never release its grip. And then, as the phantom's icy fingers tightened around her, she understood. There was no escaping Catherine. There was no saving Victor. She was doomed to be a part of this twisted, eternal love triangle, a love that defied death, but came at a terrible price. Eleanor could no longer deny it. Every part of her being screamed for answers, but no matter how hard she searched, the truth remained elusive, a shadow she couldn't outrun. The curse that had taken Victor, the darkness that had clouded their love, there was something deeper, something more sinister at play. Catherine, the ghost bride, had returned from the grave, but her vengeance was only part of the story. She spent days locked away in the study, poring over the old journals Victor had kept. The leather-bound books held memories of happier times, of a man she barely recognized. As Eleanor flipped through the pages, the dates blurred together, the words growing more erratic as Victor's obsession with Catherine grew. But it wasn't until she found the final journal, the one he had hidden beneath the floorboards, that the pieces finally began to fit together. Victor's handwriting was shaky, the ink smeared as if he had written in a frenzy, desperate to get his thoughts down before the terror consumed him entirely. She could feel his torment through every word, every stroke of the pen. Catherine's death was no accident, Eleanor. It was a sacrifice, one made to bind her to me, forever. And in the ritual, I bound myself to her, as well. Eleanor's heart stopped. The ritual. The very words that had haunted her since Catherine's return. She read on, her breath shallow. I thought I could control it. I thought if I loved her enough, I could break the curse. But love was never the answer. I made a terrible mistake. Catherine's soul was never meant to be freed, and now she haunts me, drags me into the dark. I cannot escape her, no matter how hard I try. The journal trembled in Eleanor's hands as she processed the horrific truth. Victor hadn't been cursed by a simple ghost. No, the love he had once shared with Catherine had bound them both to something far darker, a force beyond their comprehension. And it was his mistake, his unwillingness to let go, that had led them to this nightmare. Victor hadn't married her. He hadn't chosen her. He had been claimed by a force more powerful than love, one that refused to release its grip. Catherine's soul was not just a wandering spirit. It was a vengeful force, bound by the ritual Victor had unwittingly performed. And Eleanor was the one who had awakened it. The realization struck her like a dagger through the heart. She had been nothing more than a pawn in this game from the start. Her marriage to Victor had been orchestrated by forces beyond their control, drawing her into a web of deception and misery. Suddenly, the walls of the study seemed to close in on her. The air grew thick with the oppressive weight of the curse. She could feel Catherine's presence again, lingering just beyond the shadows, watching, waiting. Eleanor had awoken the ghost bride, but it wasn't just revenge that Catherine sought. It was her power, her control, her claim over Victor's soul. And Eleanor was just a means to an end. She stumbled back, the journal slipping from her grasp as the reality of it all sank in. There was no escape. She had been drawn into the web of a love that had never truly been hers to claim. Catherine's revenge had only just begun. Victor was lost to her, forever. The man she had married, the man she had loved, had been taken long ago. And now, she was left with nothing but the cruel knowledge that love, in its purest form, could lead to the darkest of curses. The truth was unbearable. She could no longer save Victor. She could no longer free him from Catherine's grasp. All she could do now was try to survive long enough to understand what came next, what Catherine wanted from her. The night had fallen again, and the shadows were drawing closer. Eleanor could feel them, creeping up the walls, slipping beneath the door, pressing against her chest. Catherine was near. And this time, she would not be ignored. The old chapel stood at the edge of the village, its crumbling stone walls bathed in the cold, silver light of the moon. Once a place of joy, where vows were exchanged in the name of love, it had long since become a place of dread. The bell tower, once a symbol of celebration, now tolled with an eerie, mournful sound, its echo reverberating through the empty streets. It was here that Eleanor found herself, drawn to the place where Victor and Catherine had once pledged their love. The chapel had been abandoned, its once beautiful stained-glass windows shattered, the pews decayed by time. But the memories, the dark energy that clung to the air, were still very much alive. As Eleanor stepped through the broken door, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floorboards creaked under her weight. She glanced around, her heart racing. The walls seemed to whisper with every breath she took, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. It was then that she saw it, the altar, bathed in an unnatural light, as if it were waiting for her. She couldn't explain why, but she knew, deep within her soul, that this was where it would all come to an end. Her footsteps faltered as she approached, and a cold gust of wind blew through the open windows, extinguishing the candles that had been lit in a futile attempt to ward off the darkness. She shivered, the temperature dropping so rapidly it felt as if the very life had been sucked from the room. And then, she heard it, the sound of a voice, soft, haunting, and unmistakable. "Eleanor," it called, a low whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She froze. Catherine. The ghost bride. Her presence was suffocating, pressing against Eleanor's chest, as if the very air itself were turning to stone. The shadows in the corners of the chapel seemed to move, writhing like serpents, their black tendrils reaching out, seeking her. "Why are you here, Eleanor?" Catherine's voice echoed, now louder, more commanding. "Do you not understand? You will never leave this place. You will never be free of me." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. She turned, searching the room for the source of the voice, but saw nothing. Only shadows. Only the cold, suffocating darkness. "I didn't come here for you," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "I came for him. I came to save Victor." "Victor is mine," Catherine's voice hissed, cold as ice. "He always was. And now, you will join us in eternal darkness." Eleanor stumbled backward, her legs weak. She wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but her feet refused to move. The weight of Catherine's words, her presence, was too much. It was as if the chapel itself had come alive, its walls closing in around her, trapping her in the past, in the curse that had begun long before she ever set foot in this place. Suddenly, she saw him, Victor, standing at the altar, his eyes vacant, his expression blank. He was no longer the man she had married. His soul had been consumed, swallowed whole by Catherine's vengeful spirit. His body, a mere vessel for her wrath, stood motionless, as though waiting for something. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she took a step toward him. "Victor," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please. Come back to me." But there was no response. No flicker of recognition in his eyes. Only an emptiness that sent a chill through her bones. And then, Catherine appeared. The ghost bride, her face pale as death, her eyes burning with a fiery rage. She stepped forward, her presence dark and overwhelming. "Victor will never be yours again," she spat. "He belongs to me, and you." Her words were cut off as Eleanor took a step closer, her eyes fixed on Victor's lifeless form. "You were once his. But you are no longer," Eleanor said, her voice firm, a new strength rising within her. "You took him from me, but I won't let you take me too." Catherine's eyes narrowed, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You cannot fight what has already been sealed. You were never meant to be here, Eleanor. You were never meant to be with him." But Eleanor, though trembling, stood her ground. "I may not be able to undo the past, but I can fight for the future. I will not let this be the end of my story." As she spoke, the chapel seemed to shudder. The air grew thick with tension, the shadows retreating, but Catherine's form grew more intense, her rage overwhelming. The battle between them was not one of violence, but of wills. And as the ghost bride's curse loomed over her, Eleanor's voice echoed through the chapel, a whisper of defiance against the darkness. "The wedding that never ended, it ends now." The chapel was silent now, the tension hanging in the air like the calm before a storm. Eleanor stood at the altar, her hands trembling, her heart heavy with both grief and determination. She could feel Catherine's presence, lingering like an oppressive fog, but something had shifted, something in the very fabric of the curse had begun to unravel. Victor's lifeless body remained at the altar, his eyes still empty, a shell of the man she had once loved. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to look away from him, even though his gaze no longer held recognition. She stepped closer, her feet moving against the cold stone floor, each step a reminder of how much she had lost. But she wasn't here to give up. She wasn't here to succumb to the darkness that had taken everything from her. She had come to put an end to the twisted love story that had bound her and Victor to a fate neither of them had chosen. As she approached Victor, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening once again. She could hear Catherine's whispers in the air, feel the cold fingers of the ghost bride brushing against her skin, trying to pull her back into the abyss. But Eleanor wouldn't yield. She reached out, her fingers brushing against Victor's cold cheek, her breath catching in her throat. "Victor," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I loved you. I still do. But I have to let you go." The words echoed through the chapel, and for a brief moment, Eleanor thought she saw a flicker of something in Victor's eyes, something like recognition, like a spark of the man he had once been. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had come. Catherine's form appeared before her then, the ghost bride materializing in a swirl of darkness. Her eyes burned with a fury that made Eleanor's blood run cold. "You think you can take him from me? You think you can end this? You cannot escape me. You are nothing but a passing shadow in the darkness of our love." Eleanor looked up at the ghost bride, her voice steady now, a fire igniting within her. "I am not just a shadow. I am a woman who loved a man who has been taken from me. And I will not allow you to keep him in the depths of your rage. This ends tonight." Catherine's face twisted in fury, her form flickering violently. The chapel trembled, as if the very earth itself were fighting against the curse that had taken hold. But Eleanor stood firm, her heart beating in time with the ancient rhythm of the chapel, the air thick with magic, with love and sorrow. She took Victor's hand in hers, her fingers intertwining with his lifeless ones, her voice soft but unwavering. "I release you from the chains that bind you," she whispered, "I release you from this curse. You are free." As she spoke those words, something shifted. The chapel seemed to shudder, the air thick with the energy of release. The shadows, once so oppressive, began to recede, their grip loosening as if the darkness itself had been undone. Catherine let out a cry of anguish, her form disintegrating into the wind, her rage unable to hold on to its victim any longer. "No," she screamed, her voice fading into nothingness. And then, as if all the pain, all the sorrow, all the love that had been twisted and corrupted, unraveled in an instant, Eleanor leaned down, pressing her lips to Victor's cold, unmoving ones. It was a kiss of finality, of goodbye. It was the kiss of a woman who had loved deeply, who had suffered, but who had finally found peace. It was the kiss that severed the last bond between her and the past. As she pulled away, tears streamed down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release. Victor was gone, and Catherine's curse had been broken. She had done what she had come to do. And in the quiet aftermath, the chapel no longer felt like a place of darkness. It felt like a place of peace. Victor was free. And so, too, was Eleanor.